he had these anomalous experiences that led up to something, and I'll get to it, but he was driving in his car, and he saw a UFO in the sky, and he was trying to follow. Now you're driving on the street, you can't drive through buildings, right? And the UFO is, like, moving through, across, trees and across, um, space, and I mean space above the buildings. But he saw this UFO, and what he noticed is that it was kind of plasmatic. It first looked like this, hard shell object, what we traditionally think of as a technology UFO. But then he noticed that it became this kind of undulating plasmatic thing. Anyway, he saw this thing, and then it zipped away and disappeared. In some later time, and I don't remember, maybe a month later or so, he was driving, and he'd been working late night shifts, he said. So he was kind of tired, and he actually crashed. So he crashed, and what he said, by the way, is he crashed in the same place that he saw the UFO. So now he has this, uh, he goes into this out of body experience this time. And in this out of body experience, he felt this presence. And it was this effusive, incredible kind of love. And like he was in the bosom of, nature that was taking care of him. And he said, even though he'd been in a crash, and even though he was in this altered state, he felt very safe. And he said, out of that came this angelic symphony, this most gorgeous music that, he really couldn't describe, but that it was just heavenly and beautiful and something he'd never quite heard before. Now, what's interesting is that's not the first time I'd heard of that kind of story. There's a story I refer to in the book that it I learned of it from Jung. So Jung wrote about, his name was Orfeo. Orfeo, interestingly, Orfeo Angelucci. Now, Orfeo means Orpheus, who is associated with music, right? And Angelucci is like angel of light, actually. Orfeo, he wrote a great book, I think in the 50s, maybe. He was an American. I think he was a mechanic, and he had this encounter. He sees this UFO. He and this is not the first time I've heard this kind of thing. The UFO is like, say, car sized. It's not that big, but he steps inside, and that's now he's in this like cathedral. It's this gigantic, and this is a common thing where space and time become, malleable and change. So this little space you think you saw now opens up into this gigantic space. And he had a couple of different kinds of music experiences. One was like popular songs of the day he heard, but then similarly, he had this angelic kind of cathedral. I think of something like Bach, the Bach masses, or this overflowing, lush sound. Um, there were other people that had those experiences, but one thing, Marwa, that I found interesting is that people had different experiences. And my prompt was to say, I asked people, can you tell me about an event, an experience that you had that associates something inexplicable with music or sound? But Michael Shermer tells a story which is analogous to the one I've just told. He and his wife got married, and his wife was very much attached to her grandfather, who passed away, could not be at the wedding. And when they get back home from the wedding, there's a radio playing somewhere in the house, and it's playing like an older kind of tune from the time of her grandfather would be alive. They can't find this radio. They're looking around. They finally find it, and I forget where it is. It's in the attic or it's somewhere. This radio that hasn't played, why is it suddenly playing? And it's playing kind of a song that's, from his period. and very uncanny. And Michael Shermer says, even himself, he says, "I cannot explain this for the life of me." But it's as if through the music, the spirit was trying to communicate, which I found fascinating.
And how you explain that?
He wrote this in, like, I think 1908, early, 1900 something. And it's the story it's a science fiction story. It's the story of this it's a world in 2 dimensions. So it's the Flatlanders, right? They only know, they only know east, west, north, south. That's all they know. Just that one this flat world. And then something comes into their world from 3 dimensions. And if you imagine a foot coming into a flat land, all they would see is the vector where that foot hit that two-dimensional world. So it would look like a smudge or something. And now when the foot disappears, he goes and walks, takes another step, right? He disappears. I think that's a great analogy to consider what may sometimes happen, um, when we have these kinds of experiences. The worlds are here, but we're not aware of them, we're not perceiving them. We don't have the right instrumentation, perceptual, uh, apparatus. But maybe with other kinds of, practices or apparatus, we can have deeper perception. Yeah, I mean, there are people wake up, Paul McCartney said he woke up and he dreamt the song complete yesterday. Yesterday, all my troubles seem so far away, and just the complete, maybe not the words, but the melody.
I make. Nice to meet you again in the podcast.
Nice to see you, Mauro. I was doing the countdown, and I think we were both, a little tricked by
Yeah,
it, but great to
good
see
to see
you.
you as well. So, first of all, congratulations the new book, UFO Symphonic. Last year,
Thank you so
yeah, last
much.
year was big, but for all we know, that was last year. And time flies,
Yes,
and you managed.
it really does. Yeah, well, thank you for having me on, and my goal has been to have, like, 1 book a year. I may be off I'm working on my next project, but I feel, number 1, I don't wanna rush it. As so much of the joy, in the book, the writing process is the actual writing. That's where I get a lot of joy. But, like, once the book is published, you go through there's a different cycle of emotions, which are up and down, but the aesthetic and the joy of the writing is that's really what I love that period. It's, so stimulating. You're dreaming, you're thinking, your book piles are stacking up, and there's all this promise and this, future. That's something I really
Mm.
enjoy.
First of all, I want to say that thank you for the copy of the book. I really enjoyed it because, first of all, I think the whole premise of the book, how the sound shape us to communicate, and I think it's. I was even discussing this with one of my friends after reading the book because my
Great.
background and my face is Islam, but we never do singing. And I attended one of my friends' events in Sunday, and they do
Mm,
singing, and we were discussing that how the singing just make them feel certain connection, emotion. And I think in your book you spoke
right.
about the Bible, and you said that some of the people like do music or musicians you call healer, and also you mentioned about the Bible and the essence of universe. So we're really thinking about the sound. I think your book
Mhm.
we take something for granted, the sound. And I think you dig deeper how this relates to the phenomena, the story in the book. And I find this really fascinating, especially when you speak about the nature, even the ocean or animals. It's a lot of things to think about what we have been taken for granted. So I appreciate this book really because it's not only about connection to UFO or the phenomena, but I want to say thank you because it's made me think deeper about something simple as sound. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you. Thank you for making and noticing that. And I think that you're right. And one thing I wanted to do was what I saw was in researching the phenomena, researching the UFO phenomena, and you'll notice I use the footnote of the phenomena to refer to really a constellation uh, of of things like supernatural events, mystical events. So it's kind of all encompassing. But what I noticed is there wasn't really a book or a study and that brought together music and the phenomena. So that's what commenced this initiative is to say, well, I'm a musician. I'm very interested in sound, and but I can't find a full length study that connects the two phenomena. What I discovered as I began to do my research, and you brought that up at the outset, is it really was more than just music. So there's a sound component that it occurs in chanting. It occurs in prayer. There are other things like you probably saw binaural beats. So binaural beats is something that the Monroe Institute um, experimented with, and they came up with this thing called hemisync. And so hemisync, that's a kind of trademark that Robert Monroe, the Monroe Institute, came up with, and it's so I have two frequencies that are occurring, different frequencies in each ear, and it creates this kind of warble effect that puts you in a kind of a hypnagogic state, like a pre-dreaming state, and it's very effective. I did some courses. I did some work with Mark Cherto's. I forget what his. It'll come to me. I forget what his. It's like an alternative to. He worked with Robert Monroe, and he helped develop the hemisync technology. And I found it incredibly powerful. You go into these dream states. You basically go on journeys where you may have encounters. You may have experiences that you might not otherwise have. Um, I would liken it to chanting, to using I talked about, sound baths. So you go to places where they use chimes, sound bowls, maybe gongs, and wow, that's it's really powerful because it kind of washes over you. So the guy that I talked to, Lewis Maurer, he said that sometimes he gets people come in. Like the husband comes in with the wife and, he sort of came dragged along or vice versa. One comes dragged along by the other. "Ugh, I don't really want to be here, but, she made me come, so." And then they walk out with tears, in their eyes. They walk out having had revelations, having had experiences. So there's something about this it's beyond your control.
When you say beyond our control, because to be honest, before recording, we speak about aging, every time, at least for me, when I reflect about life, I feel every time there's a lot of things beyond our control, like phenomena, like this phenomena, or even seeing life. I just feel mystery every time you can't understand.
I completely agree, and I think that's something that I investigated, and it's kind of a it's a crucial piece of this overall research. This notion that and I think we talked about this in our conversation about For All We Know, we live in this kind of egocentric, um, state where we think we know the parameters of our existence. We have our job, we have our routine, um, we approach life logically, and we feel like we have it under wraps and under control. And I see of course, that makes sense that we have to have those things to make progress throughout our lives, to pay the bills, to do the things we must do to live. but that we become enamored with it. We become enamored with that bounded existence. As you said, there's so much we're not in control of, but we don't know that we're not for the most part until something happens. And that could be some kind of trauma. That could be, something like an out of body experience, or, I just recently, broke my arm, and that experience and how that all went down, it really takes you out of your ego. And when it happened, I felt like kind of like an animal wounded on the side of the road, and you feel very small. Um, but the point of this book was sound takes us out of our ego. And even in the simplest ways. So sound music can take you out of your ego where you're just reminiscing about the past. Music that you associate with some period of your life or not. Maybe I hear music I've never heard before and it just chills me. It makes me feel nostalgic. It could be from another culture or it makes you feel joyful. Um, if you think about it, music is associated with most major ceremonies of life, marriage, funerals, graduations. Think about it. Even sports events have music to sort of rile a crowd up and that kind of thing. And and then there's the other kinds of music slash sound. Again, takes us out of our ego, where we encounter other aspects of the field of experience that's there. It may be sitting kind of in the background, but it's not in the focal point of our perception.
Yeah, I want to ask you because I think I'm
Yeah.
very much interested, I think, in the stories. What I like about book, you take us in the journey, and I think the stories about the people trusted you to share their experiences, and especially the angelic voices. And I remember when I was a child, I think my late mom she said one of her colleague she was listening to humming voice while she's sleeping, and she thought to be angels humming in her ear. So I'm not sure how this is true because I think somehow we speak about sounds that doesn't make sense, but at the same time, it's just comforting. It's just I think
Mhm.
that's what you're trying. So can you tell me about that? The sounds, especially in outwardly experiences that we don't know where it come from.
Yeah. I mean, think about it now, and I'll get back to your question, but think about, there are sounds that dogs hear that we don't hear. There are sounds that are happening right now that are maybe industrial sounds that are going beyond your audio ability. There are visual uh, perceptions that are just out of your range of visibility. So there's so much. I mean, we have with this equipment, we see within certain ranges and certain bounds. However, sometimes that could be affected by a circumstance, and that could be something like, um, and again, I go back to trauma. Trauma has a way of knocking you out of your typical everyday experience, your perceptual experience, where you may experience more. But to get back to your question, so I found that there are different ways. You could have sound that takes you on a journey, sound that takes you out of yourself, and sometimes out of extraordinary experiences come sounds, come music. So, for instance, I think you were talking about the chapter, the angelic voices. So there are a few people that talked about that, which I found very interesting. But in one case, so James Iandoli, who he runs the Engaging the Phenomena podcast, which is a great podcast. I become friends with James. And James said that he had these anomalous experiences that led up to something, and I'll get to it, but he was driving in his car and he saw a UFO in the sky. And he was trying to follow. Now you're driving on the street, you can't drive through buildings, right? And the UFO is like moving through, across trees and across um, space. and I mean space above the buildings. But he saw this UFO, and what he noticed is that it was kind of plasmatic. It first looked like this, hard shell object, what we traditionally think of as a technology UFO. But then he noticed that it became this kind of undulating plasmatic thing. Anyway, he saw this thing, and then it zipped away and disappeared. In some later time, and I don't remember, maybe a month later or so, he was driving and he'd been working late night shifts, he said. So he's kind of tired, and he actually crashed. So he crashed, and what he said, by the way, is he crashed in the same place that he saw the UFO. So now he has this, uh, he goes into this out of body experience this time. And in this out of body experience, he kind of had this, he felt this presence. And it was this effusive, incredible kind of love. And like he was in the bosom of, nature that was taking care of him. And he said, even though he'd been in a crash, and even though he was in this altered state, he felt very safe. And he said, out of that came this angelic symphony, this most gorgeous music that, he really couldn't describe, but that it was just heavenly and beautiful and something he'd never quite heard before. Now, what's interesting is that's not the first time I'd heard of that kind of story. There's a story I refer to in the book that it I learned of it from Jung. So Jung wrote about, his name was Orfeo. Orfeo, interestingly, Orfeo Angelucci. Now, Orfeo means Orpheus, who is associated with music, right? And Angelucci is like angel of light, actually. Orfeo, he wrote a great book, I think in the 50s, maybe. He was an American. I think he was a mechanic, and he had this encounter. He sees this UFO. He and this is not the first time I've heard this kind of thing. The UFO is like, say, car sized. It's not that big. But he steps inside, and that's now he's in this, like, cathedral. It's this gigantic, and this is a common thing where space and time become, malleable and change. So this little space you think you saw now opens up into this gigantic space. And he had a couple of different kinds of music experiences. One was, like, popular songs of the day he heard. But then similarly, he had this angelic kind of cathedral. I think of something like Bach, the Bach masses, or, this overflowing, lush sound. Um, there were other people that had those experiences, but one thing, Marwa, that I found interesting is that people had different experiences. And my prompt was to say, I asked people, can you tell me about an event, an experience that you had that associates something inexplicable with music or sound. So I didn't wanna lead them on and say, "Tell me this cookie cutter thing," because I want a template that I'm gonna repeat, 10 or 15 times over. So some of it came through, I mean, an instrument, or an instrument, a flute that didn't play, that suddenly played, and it was my friend's, wife or significant other's flute. She'd passed away from cancer relatively young. Uh, and Frank's, uh, uh, Sue, her name was Sue Cunningham. And so Frank, had this flute, that was Sue's flute that hadn't played. And it's a friend of ours that we both know, who's a kind of pretty famous bluegrass musician, Peter Rowan, was visiting his house. And Peter said, "What's that box over there?" And Frank said, "Oh, that was Sue's flute." And Frank wanted to tell Peter about a song he was thinking of, and he wanted to write. Anyway, Peter picked up the flute, He started to assemble it. And, Frank's not thinking because he's telling Peter about this song that he wants to write. Peter takes the flute out, assembles it, starts playing on the flute. Frank thinks, okay, he's not listening to me. He's just in his own world, playing on the flute. And then Peter proceeds to say, okay, I have this on audio, by the way. I have the whole file of it. Write this down. I have the first verse. I have the melody. Here's the melody. Here's the first verse. And Frank, that thing you were saying, that's the chorus. So they wrote this song on this flute that was Sue's flute. And then after a period of time, they put it down, put the flute down. They Peter picked the flute back up and it wouldn't play. And it just sort of was like just blue air. And it's never played again. And I I had a little anecdote after that story. I think his name is Michael Shermer. I always get his name wrong. You know Michael Shermer, he's a kind of known debunker. He's a known debunker, and, I think skeptics are great. You should be skeptical. We shouldn't just believe anything. Um, Although I think everything is possible, but that's another thing. I think good skepticism makes sense, but Michael Shermer tells a story which is analogous to the one I've just told. He and his wife got married, and his wife was very much attached to her grandfather, who passed away, could not be at the wedding. And when they get back home from the wedding, there's a radio playing somewhere in the house, and it's playing like an older kind of tune from the time her grandfather would be alive. They can't find this radio. They're looking around. They finally find it, and I forget where it is. It's in the attic or it's somewhere. This radio that hasn't played, why is it suddenly playing? And it's playing kind of a song that's, from his period. And very uncanny. And Michael Shermer says, even himself, he says, "I cannot explain this for the life of me." But it's as if through the music, the spirit was trying to communicate, which I found fascinating.
And how you explain that? I believe in that, to be honest, to some extent. There's truth to that. I feel, I think you said this before, maybe there's something, I don't know, like parallel universe or something. I don't know how to explain that. It's quite scary to our brain, and at the same time, I believe it. But how do you explain that from your limited knowledge?
Well, I think that, when we say parallel universe, yeah, sure. I mean, I could speculate as much as anyone, and maybe it's all here right now. It's all kind of intersecting. There are other universes, experiences that are intersecting with our world right here and now, and we're just not aware of them. That would seem to be that would seem to make sense. Do you know the story of Flatland by Edwin Abbott?
No.
So he wrote this in, like, I think 1908, early 1900 something. And it's a science fiction story. It's a story of this it's a world in two dimensions. So it's the Flatlanders, right? They only know east, west, north, south. That's all they know. Just that one this flat world. And then something comes into their world from three dimensions. And if you imagine a foot coming into a flat land, all they would see is the vector where that foot hit that two-dimensional world. So it would look like a smudge or something. And now when the foot disappears, he goes and walks, takes another step, right? He disappears. I think that's a great analogy to consider what may sometimes happen, um, when we have these kinds of experiences. The worlds are here, but we're not aware of them. We're not perceiving them. We don't have the right instrumentation, perceptual uh, apparatus. But maybe with other kinds of, uh, you know, uh, practices or apparatus, we can have deeper perception.
Let me ask you this question. Like, I
Yeah.
think there's other things and the book is interesting, but this is a question I'm struggling with because it comes down, we believe, as human, you say, we have job and life, traditional life, and we don't have time to think about these things. And I think the scary thing as we aging, I feel like this desire that you want, yeah, maybe some of us will, yeah, figure it out or not figure it out. I think to question the question, some they don't question ever, but it's just for me. Do you think the creator, like God, I need to understand that. Like, do you believe? I asked this question before, but I think this question will never end until we leave this earth. But
All right.
it is one God. And if there is one God, why he would create these things? I'm struggling to understand that. Even if there's some intelligent extraterrestrial like being, it's just why? It's just is it a game? Is it why? I'm struggling to be honest. On you
Yeah.
understand the purposes, of the good value, kindness, helping one another, learning lessons, trauma, for example. I want to ask you about the trauma because I think it's also another thing. Changes your perception, but why? And who is it one God? I tried to this is burned you. Yes, there's good and evil, and there is. I know the justification, but to be honest, I'm still not convinced. Why all of that?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I had a definitive answer, um, for sure, as you know, and if I did, I'd probably, I'd be super famous or something like that. Not that I'd want that necessarily, but I think people have thought about this. There's a great poem, by it's he's a Renaissance poet, George Herbert, English Renaissance poet. It's called The Collar, and it's about faith. And he basically says, and I'll expand on the answer, but he says, you know, I struggle with my faith and this thing that this collar, this uh the in the struggle, something emerges out of it. This thing that because if I had the answers, I wouldn't have to struggle. And so there's something in that. Then there's also this notion of I saw. Do you know the author Philip K. Dick? He was a science fiction writer.
No, I don't know. No.
He and I'm sorry about that. Not a. I don't mean to ask questions. It just helps if someone knows. But he wrote these super interesting books on basically saying that what we live in is a matrix. We live in this kind of this. It's something like what you might call the Maya. We live in this world and it is we don't perceive the ultimate reality of it. It's probably presenting, an alternative, another reality, and it certainly is. Um, and I'll go into that for a minute. So the reality that we see out there is not this objective thing waiting for us to discover it. What we come to in our perceptual apparatus within our social context, we kind of co-create the reality we see. We don't see, as Kant said, we don't see the thing in itself, the Ding ein sich. We we see the uh, uh, we see things according to uh, the the contextual time, the society, the era that I'm from. I mean, take a look, for example, at how the UFO phenomena has changed over time and changes across cultures. People have experiences. This is ubiquitous and undeniable, but those experiences vary. As after World War II, the UFO phenomena begins to look like a kind of hard shelled, steel technological flying disc. Prior to that, it was a chariot. Prior to that, it was a dirigible. In some cultures, it's a fairy, um, a woodland fairy. Not surprisingly, often from cultures that have woodlands, that have those kind of environments, or a djinn, or it seems to come in the robe of expectation that we have. I like the idea of there's the Gnostic idea. So there's what they call the Gnostic Gospels, and the Gnostic Gospels, which were kind of excluded from the Christian Bible. Um, they sort of lay out this you have the opportunity to experience revelation, and you have to work toward it. And there's a kind of there's protocol, there's practices to you are God is essentially what is the basic idea. But you have to work towards practices to achieve that state. The reason I say that is when you say, what is the answer and why are we presented with this? Um, I think in the process of trying to understand it, something is achieved, I think. And at the same time, I do also feel that it is mostly will be inexplicable in our mostly in our everyday lives. Maybe we have glimmers of it. I have my dreams are often very prophetic. Do you have prophetic dreams? Do you find?
I had. I had actually, and I never get explanations sometimes. Some of them, yeah, I think you say it's something I really like it in the book. Let me go through my notes, but where it is. Yeah, dreaming. I think it was in chapter Dreaming UFO. I intended this title. I think the chapter was Dreaming UFO. The title have double meaning. Do we dream the UFO or do UFO dream us into being? I really like it that. So yeah. But before going to the point, yes, I had a period in my life. I was obsessed by dreams. And when I was young also had this kind of dream that represents something. It was like prophecy for something happen. And I had one experience when I was 13. I was laying in the bed behind my grandma, and I was thinking about soul and body, and I was talking to God, what soul? I need to understand that. And I swear to you, I wasn't sleeping. I was really awake, and I found myself all of a sudden in just like a white vortex. I felt like I'm entering. I hear the sound. I remember there was sound in my ear, just like intense, and I like sucked in like a vortex or something like that. I don't know. I don't know what it
Mm,
is, but it was sound like no, not noise, but I never. I don't know what it is, but it's just something like sucked in, and I feel pressure and sound. I don't know how to explain this to make
mm,
that. And then all of a sudden, I felt my body moving. I'm not kidding. Of course, I was telling
mm,
you, I was joking, but I felt my body moving, and I felt, I saw. I think I felt my soul was moving, and I felt my body there in the bed, and I'm moving, and I was screaming in my thoughts, God, please, I don't want this now, yeah, to die, basically.
mm.
So, and I all of a
Right.
sudden I gave up. That happened when I was 13. Just to
Mm.
understand it, that what happened. Yeah.
I would love if you would write that down and send it to me because I'm working on something that I would love to be able to, if you would like to contribute a story to it, that would be wonderful. Um, but I do think that the it's I think that the phenomena speaks to us, and I wrote about this in the book. It speaks to us through myth and through and sound sound is akin to myth because when we hear sound, it's a trigger is what it is. It's I like to use the word it deliteralizes. So because we think we're gonna figure this all out in literal language, and oftentimes it it just it evades that. It seems like dreams, which take us to the transpersonal, it's some deeper aspect of us, of ourselves, but also to this other transpersonal realm. And I speculate, and because I don't purport to have the final answers. You'll notice the book is very open. That I'm not making final statements. I'm really asking questions and expressing some ideas, but I'm not making final statements. Um, but I think that dreams, in music, when I'm if I'm listening to music, it may take me out of myself into some other realm, and that realm could be as simple as a remembrance of something from before, or it could be an extraordinary out of body experience where I have an encounter with another intelligence, or maybe an intelligence that's somehow me reflecting back, or maybe all of this is us reflecting back. Maybe what we're seeing is some aspect of our collective unconscious that is in communication with us, and these are just pure speculations. Um, yeah, I had a dream, and it's so rich. It's so rich with metaphor, and I can, on one level, it makes so much sense. So let me explain the dream. As you probably remember from For All We Know, I grew up, I would say, pretty modest. And I came from the projects in New York City, which is, it means low income. That's what it generally means. Um, and I often go back to the projects in my dreams now. I would say mostly I always have, but it's like I go back to um, that place, and I kind of I traverse the same street coming up, from the south of the projects, and coming, going up it's a main thoroughfare that goes over main major bridges, and it's like a real key, uh, a key transportation area in New York City. And I had this dream last night that I was sort of floating. I was on balloons, and I'm floating down 21st Street. Except there's a big wind, by the way. It's at night, and it's kind of rain, and I can't see too well. And I'm holding these balloons. I think they're balloons that are holding me up. But my back is I'm not facing where I'm going. My back is in the direction I'm going. I'm facing the wind. And I say, "Oh, I should turn around." So I turn around. Now the wind is blowing me. And I'm blowing with the wind up the street. And I think, "Okay, I have to be careful because there are cars coming perpendicular to me. I don't wanna be hit by the cars as I'm rushed along." And, I come up, the street, and I see these, I grew up actually right near the Department of Sanitation, if you could believe it. So we would have these gigantic garbage trucks that were parked outside where we lived. And all this being said, this place is this precious mythological realm. Every time I go there, it's like this, emotional, powerful place that as a kid, and up until probably not too long ago, didn't have that kind of meaning for me. But now it's rich with, source material. It's like, it's primordial. It's it's the it's kind of at the bottom level of my consciousness, I
Is
realize.
it because you grew up there? It's like your
Be
home.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's like where, mom and dad who are not here anymore, and it's that world, that, like, incubation, that nest. Um, but I just find it interesting, and I find in dreams, I often have dreams of UFO experiences, UFO encounters, which I read about in the book, and they're revelatory. It's usually, there's some magnificent light. There's this, gigantic illumination, and I'm in awe, and I'm usually saying, "That's a UFO. Wow, that's a UFO," and I'm in this stunned state, and extraordinary things happen where, and I read about this in the book as well, that we know when you're dreaming, and it gets back to the Matrix. I'll explain it. So when you're dreaming, you say, "Okay, well, the ceiling just broke open, and now something's coming out of the ceiling," right? Like, things aren't working in the everyday physics way. Someone just popped in from a window. How did they get there? You can move, you can fly, you can do things you don't normally do in everyday reality. Now that should be rich with fairy tale and all of that, just these mentionings. It's interesting how UFO experiences or experiences with the phenomena are similar in that UFOs often move in ways that aren't they don't comport with everyday reality. Um, uh, uh, Fairies can appear and disappear. Um, Beings emerge from walls. You know, you can traverse space. Now, going back to the question we talked about earlier, the Matrix that Philip K. Dick talked about. So we're in this, and I'm not going to say it's not. It's reality is everyday reality is real. I mean, break your arm and then ask that question. You know, I thought that was a very interesting lesson because, man, I was in tremendous pain. And it's real. You know, losing someone you love is very real, and it's not to be trifled with. I think the point there is it's not ultimately the entire reality. There is something to the provisional nature of this experience of life. Things are they're transient, and I don't mean to sound cliche, but, you know, take this cup, you know, or even me, you know, even, my body, for example. I'll put the cup down. You know, I am there is more of not me than me in my body. There is more biota of bacteria, fungi, and other living species that are not me than it is my own DNA. And yet, this is me. Believe that I am me. You know, of course, I am. It's a paradox. But what about when this body breaks down? You know, and returns to the soil. You know, who is me 100 years from now? Is it the things I've written? Where how do I manifest, you know, in terms of this in this realm, in this world, in this kind of universe? You know, not talking about the that I go back into this to the, to the bosom of the cosmos where I'm joined with another other souls, or I am just one of the many. Um, this world is transient, and it is a kind of matrix. And that doesn't sound conspiratorial I mean, even physics is telling us this. Physics is confirming this, and actually has been for 100 years. I think it was Schrodinger that said, reality is not what you think it is. This is not this experience is not all there is.
Uh, yeah, I can relate to that. I think I understand. Yeah, uh, it's yeah. I don't know how to explain that. To be honest, I'm still not fully 100% reconciled with it because I understand. Yeah, this experience is. I don't know if I should say it. Like my mom also, when she passed, I tried to like the last moment of her, and I like breathing, and I hear the echo, and at that moment I realized this is just a body, it's not a soul there. But yeah, I never said this before, but I think as a human we try to forget it, but it's just yeah, you're right. When we don't have this body, what who you are actually, the soul, what it is. So
Mm.
you're right. Yeah.
The question, I was this is a few months ago. My mother passed away about 2 years ago, but I was walking down the street and I just had this like wind whoosh into me. And and I I said, "Hi, mom." And like she was basically saying hello, and I wasn't thinking about her prior. It just sometimes these things happen. Yeah, you really feel it. And it was like chills. And I could feel like her sense of humor, her I could almost feel because the way she would joke with me, she actually had a great sense of humor. And we could, tease each other and keep it fun. And it was just that kind of thing where she
Are you
sort of caught me
crying?
by
You
pardon?
have a bit of tears or what? You have a bit of tears, I feel.
I do, yeah, well, I can get emotional. I did an interview, Marwa, for the book, and gosh, this guy asked a question, and I absolutely broke down, and I mean, I made it out of it, but and I felt a little embarrassed, but at the end of the day, it was like, "Ah, whatever," and it's just what happened. But he asked a question about my father and, some of the music he listened to, and I just was, caught by surprise. And, these things happen, you know?
So I think I want to ask you, it's because I know this stuff is not light. I think I understand that, but I think it's beautiful also. Um, there's lots of things I really like in the book, like the history. Like when you spoke about the Neanderthals, I didn't know, to be honest, they do the thinking. And
Yeah,
I was discussing with one of the friends that yeah, like us Homo sapiens, we already know we speak about the singing and music industry, but Neanderthals, can you tell me how singing and sound could, yeah, make them survive? I think in back then. So can you tell me about that? Because I think it was really fascinating to know about them.
yeah, it seems as if, there's a book called The Singing Neanderthals, and it seems that singing preceded language, and part of that is the anatomy. Language is such a complex, as opposed to, say, going, but speaking, and as I'm speaking and I'm thinking, and simultaneously my tongue is working with my mouth and my brain to come up with these, words that I'm speaking in real time. I mean, that's just an incredible thing. But it appears that we had the anatomy to sing, and, what we have found in modern in primates in currently in this time is that they also use singing to communicate, humming. So gorillas have a when they eat favorite foods, when they eat in general, they hum, but they have humming their favorite songs, their favorite foods, I'm sorry. They kind of have a special eating, and they're not necessarily melodic. They may kind of break up, they're not pure melody, but they're humming. And then they use, kind of musical communication to, when they're grooming, for example. And it may also to communicate, the business of the day. I'm paraphrasing because I don't speak primate. Well, I do actually. It's called human, language. Because after all, we're really just, we're just monkeys anyway. Um, that they have, to communicate the business of the day, to say, okay, we're going to eat here now, and then we're going to move on. Um, and we have observed these things. So there is communication. They may not have the anatomy that we have to form use language the way we do. But what's interesting is that there were studies that I read that in singing, it kind of clears out the detritus of, like, brain matter, brain debris. So, like, non-essential, debris gets cleaned out by singing. And I think I said something like we kind of sang ourselves, we sang ourselves, into evolution. Um, and if you think about it, they say that when you hum, for example, um, if you are in a if something is happening and you begin to hum, it kind of insulates you a bit from what's going on. It sort of buffers you somehow. The non-specific linguistic. But I found that very interesting. And when you think that if we were singing or making sounds, even joyful, or those sounds were probably emotionally rich, when we could do those sounds without having the anatomy to make speech. And that's in music. I mean, you hear it in, especially kind of, a folk more folk kind of music, in a Neapolitan, music. It's called the Napoletana canzone, and by the way, it comes from, uh, supposedly it was brought, by the Arabs to Southern Europe, and we share semitone, the use of using semitones. So you'll hear now most people don't know that music, Neapolitan, they know the kind of the Americanized versions of it, or they know maybe opera, which opera will teach those, guttural things out of your, your singing, style. But you'll hear, kind of things that I would hear in when you listen to, music from, the Middle East. But there's also emotion, and you'll hear cries and guttural, "Ugh," these kinds of sounds, which would sound to people like my father, hearing that, there was an emotional connection. It meant something to people like him of his generation. It connected them back to, their ancestors and their grandfathers and something. Um, but to other people, it may have sounded, well, that it sounds too folksy. It sounds too, uh, it's not, I don't know, it's not pop or something. But that was a long-winded answer, to your question, and that's something I just stumbled upon in my research. I didn't expect to have to read books on linguistics. I read books on musicology. Where does music come from? No one can answer it. No one can answer it. Why do we do music? It's not necessary. It's not like eating, or breathing. It's something else. We don't really know why I mean, we all know we like music, and people like music and they want music and they have music in their lives and they say, I can't live without it. But you kind of, it's a mystery, I think. I
I
think it's
think we do.
wrapped up in, the
Mm.
ultimate question of what it is to be human, if you ask me.
I know that you have to leave in a few minutes, but let me ask you
Yeah.
questions. To be honest, when I read the book and when I was going for work and I was trying to listen to different music, especially the old ones, it's just to be honest, I feel the creativity, and you speak about the creativity in your book, but I found something brilliant in how you make music, just the sound, the instrument, and I'm not sure did you find anything mystical specific instrument? Because I know there's certain like music or tools used in different era. Yeah, but I'm not sure I was scared. I still need to study this, but
Yeah.
I don't know how to answer how people come with such composition just out of nowhere. It just this is brilliant. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there are people wake up, Paul McCartney said he woke up and he dreamt the song complete yesterday. Yesterday, all my troubles seem so far away, and just the complete, maybe not the words, but the melody and the changes. Why she had to go, I don't know. The whole thing. And many composers, but it's beyond just composition. It's things like, um, I think, Crick said that he dreamt what the DNA molecule, he dreamt he had the inspiration for it in a dream. And it's very common. People have a eureka moment in an altered state, because when we're in our paradigm kind of closed, bounded world, we're not thinking out of the box. We're not when we're dreaming, when we're music. Basically, it brings us into an altered state, and I do think that's fascinating. That out of nothing, there's a book by Eric Wargo, From Nowhere. Eric Wargo, who wrote Time Loops, and where do these things come from? What realm? You know, how does a fully formed idea happen in a dream? But it's very, very common, and then it becomes something meaningful to everyone. Isn't that, fascinating?
It is, and I found this to be a bit of mystery as the creativity, intuition, whatever. But these things, I don't know. And also maybe the question I want to ask you, since we speak about the UFO, one of the things there's no sound because have you ever thought about that? Most of these phenomena they just don't hear sound most of the time.
Right, that's a thing that what I would say too about the phenomena is that it's not monolithic. It's,
Mm.
some people there is no sound. It could be actually eerie silence. It is they call it the Oz effect, where there's this kind of this, feeling, this atmosphere of something magical, but it's, it's not everyday experience, reality, and it could be completely silent. So I think it comes to you in whatever manifestation it does, and it may depend on you, and maybe it doesn't depend on you.
I love what you say depend on you because I know that there's always an interesting point, but that's I think what I think about life. Does it happen because what do you think? Like like when the phenomena show themselves certain people, is it because of you, right? I'm not sure if we I don't know if you understand me, but I feel to some extent something is happening in our reality depending in how we manifest it a little bit. It's not just happening to us out of nowhere. Do you agree with me in that to some extent? I don't know. Um,
Well, I have to say I don't really know the answer, but I know that there are people who didn't ask for it. They didn't want it. In fact, it becomes an onus to them, and it's
mm,
sort of a problem. And now maybe with their in their marriage or to other people, they have to explain this thing, and it's problematic. And then um, it's something they wish hadn't happened. Now, I but at the same time, y you know, even those people may have, over time, an experience that the initial ontological shock really rocked their world, and of course it would. Of course, this thing that sort of manifests and it's speaking in a mythological language that, you know, we're not equipped to really understand. It's that smudge in flatland that just appears out of nowhere in our three-dimensional world, and it's perplexing. It it's it often is upsetting, not always, because some people have, they immediately have a loving and a wonderful kind of joyful experience. But some people have, Whitley, Strieber has, it's terrifying in his descriptions of his encounters and other people. Um, and why is that? I don't know. I mean, is it what we bring to it? Um, it's really hard to say. Um, it's but I do think that it is breadcrumbs often that leads us to potential, expanded experience and maybe awareness.
yeah. Maybe the following question in this book, writing this book, what it changes in you? Just because you always speak about the style of writing and you plan to every year to write a book, but in this book, what really touched you deeply
Hmm.
by the end of writing it? How did you feel like once you ended the last chapter? Yeah.
Well, thank you, and thank you for all the questions, by the way. I really appreciate that, and thank you for reading the book, so sensitively. I would say that the my what I went into writing the book is not what I came out with. So I was my it was a learning process for me, and on a number of levels. That's one of the joys of writing a book is ultimately you're learning. You're doing research, and you're having to pivot, and now you're having to make sense of the things you didn't understand. Um, so I would say that one of the things I learned from this book, it wasn't just music. That's where I started, and of course I knew of course chanting but these other sound baths and uh, uh, binaural beats and this other larger field of sound, which has kind of keyed me into more acutely paying attention to pure sound. Um, it was also a great honor to hear other people's stories. I wanted to make sure that experiencers had their say. You'll notice I didn't interpret them. I would have my story, my section, an experiencer story, and then a section. My hope was that they would speak to each other on some level, but I didn't want to interpret. I wanted to give just the space of their voice and let it sit there. And I'm fascinated by how people have responded to those stories.
Again, thank you so much. I'll be honest. I feel like first you have a calming voice. I appreciate it. You have, I don't know, but you have a really calming voice. So thank you so much, and I think you're a great storyteller as well. So and your style is unique. I see this in Chile. I really like your style of writing. So thank you
Well,
so
thank
much,
you.
and I can't wait to see the next book as well. Yeah,
Marwa, it's always great to speak to you, and I let's not wait until the next book too, and let's just stay in touch. I'm curious to hear about all the developments that you're working on. But thank you for having me, and it's just always a pleasure, and I mean that. So uh, enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll be in touch soon.